What's happening next door has not indirect, a direct impact on all of us. The lost opportunity, the lost promise has an impact on all of us. If we're going to reconstitute who we are as a community, it cannot just be in sort of silos. It has to be all of us thinking this through and making a commitment to building a new basis for social cohesion that includes everyone. One of the key issues that we need to address is what is happening with regard to access to employment for many, both immigrants as well as racialized. And it means that we have to address why there are barriers to access, why people are not getting the kinds of jobs that they are trained for, why when they get into the fields for which they have training, they're not able to move up. There isn't the kind of upward mobility that leads them to the places where they should be able to contribute. Why all of that means a significant amount of de-skilling and loss of potential. That would be a significant contribution to the community. Are we optimally utilizing our human resource? And can we, unless and if we address some of those barriers to access to employment? And so, one of the issues that I think is important for us to talk about is the issue of discrimination in employment, because it continues to determine whether we are able to get the most out of our entire population. And it continues to determine the possibilities for individuals, and that ultimately determines whether people are going to live in poverty or are going to rise to become full members of our society. So differential treatment in recruitment and hiring and promotion, extensive reliance on non-transparent forms of recruitment, such as word of mouth, which tends to reproduce and reinforce existing social networks, the differential valuation, or in essence, the devaluation of internationally obtained skills and credentials, the use of immigrant status as a proxy for tagging people with lower human capital, issues that we need to address. What are some of the outcomes of those kinds of processes? Here's really something that is interesting. And some of you might have seen this data previously, but in 1980, recent immigrants earned 85 cents to the dollar that their Canadian-born counterparts earned. By 2005, that had gone down to 63 cents. We are actually losing ground at a time when we are having more people come into the country. We're losing ground in terms of incomes, whether it is amongst women, whether it's amongst men, or it's amongst university educated. We're losing substantial ground. And so it is no mystery why when you look at neighborhoods that have a disproportionate number of racialized people, immigrants, it's no mystery that they're living in poverty. They're giving away too much by way of compensation. Just referencing a study done by the Ryerson University Diversity Institute, by educational attainment and immigrant status. What we're seeing increasingly is that the arc is downward for immigrants, continues to rise for Canadian-born. So that education does not necessarily predict success. In terms of earnings, South Asians earn the lowest income average, this is average income, compared to white immigrants. Even within the immigrant group, there's a sorting. That is, white immigrants at a higher level of income, other groups at a much lower level of income. Here we have South Asians and Chinese and Black, substantially less than white immigrants. Skill utilization. What are people doing when they come into the country? Do the jobs that they take fully utilize their skills? And when that question was asked, yes, a lot of people answered, like you just did. You can see how many people in the various groups answered no to that. So in terms of identifying what some of the barriers are to employment, lack of Canadian experience, lack of the social networks that people utilize to get access to employment information. Some people do not have strong enough language skills to be able to maintain employment. And in many cases, it is just outright discrimination that people experience. I work with an organization called Color Poverty, and our work is largely aimed at surfacing the reality of poverty as being racialized. We're talking about poverty as a differentialized experience. And by the way, when we talk about poverty as a differentialized experience, what we're talking about is that there are people who live in poverty who share a weakness in their livelihood, but who come about that weakness in different ways. Women have a different set of challenges that are responsible for them ending up disproportionately in poverty. Racialized groups have different sets of challenges that are responsible for them ending up in poverty. Disabled people have different sets of challenges that are responsible for them ending up in poverty. Aboriginal people have different experiences. It is important for us to name those challenges and to have public policy responses that take into consideration those challenges. It is important for us to name the experience of colonization for Aboriginal people because it defines how they interact with the rest of Canadian society and how they interact with the labor market. It is important for us to name racism and racial discrimination when it comes to racialized people and immigrants. It's important for us to name sexism and patriarchy when it comes to talking about how women are incorporated into the labor market. And we need to have, it's the same, of course, for persons with disabilities. And we need to have strategies that focus on those particular challenges. We cannot have an anti-poverty strategy that is generic, because generic will not address those realities. What generic will do is it may lower some of the levels of poverty, but it will not address the structural problems within the groups that are poor. So what you will have is the groups that are most disadvantaged because of the hierarchies that are responsible for them being in poverty will increase in terms of their proportion of the poor. And to some extent, that is what explains the chart that I had up there, showing that from 2001 to 2006, we had an increase in the proportion of poor who are racialized. The argument I'm trying to make is we need to have, with regard to racialization of poverty, we need to have an anti-racism analysis. I also want to suggest that we need to have a comprehensive plan that is aimed at addressing issues of poverty. That also uses an anti-racism and equity lens in terms of analyzing poverty, in terms of talking about how we establish targets as well as timelines. We need to go beyond simply looking at income to looking at other dimensions of the experience of poverty. Housing. How do people end up congregated in poverty in particular neighborhoods? A lot of it has to do with housing. What's available, what's not available, at what cost in the market, or what the state or the region and province are prepared to do in terms of generating affordable housing, right? Also has to do with the experiences of discrimination in terms of access to housing. Healthcare, childcare. There are so many racialized women, and other women, but racialized women in particular, whose access to the labor market is determined by access to childcare, or the lack thereof. So many. I used to tell the story of, I don't have time for a story, but a quick one because it's really poignant. This woman who used to run a newspaper route, an immigrant woman, had 2 kids, 3 o'clock in the morning, had to do the run, and used to take her kids with her, lock them in the van, and go and do the drops, and come back. People should not have to make those kinds of choices. Not in a country this rich. Not in a society that sees itself as humane and generous and tolerant. Should not. Part of the problem, by the way, with that woman is that someone called the Children's Aid Society on her. And she had to go through a whole period of fighting with CAS folks. I understand their obligation, but look at the circumstances we have put this woman in and the choices she's trying to make in terms of providing for her children. It is those realities that we have to address, and really at that emotional level, if we're going to seriously address issues of racialized poverty. I think it's important for us to look at a range of programs and policy responses, but also be prepared to measure progress. And as we measure, to also ensure that we're measuring what's happening with every and all groups, so that it isn't, again, a generic process of measuring. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. So Sharon says we should be done, but let's do about a couple minutes of questions and hopefully answers. Yes?
Just going back to the beginning, can you just talk briefly about your choice and the current choice to talk about racialized groups versus this?
Oh, you're talking about the how to talk about those groups? Okay, so I have a problem with visible minorities as a term. Partly because I think it is euphemistic and does not talk about the actual experience. I think the experience is an experience of racialization. And I think that we just need to be quite prepared to talk about that as the case. Second, there's a bit of a conceptual problem with visible minorities. Okay, so now in Hill region, that group so identified is 50, maybe more than 50% of the population. Can you still be able to talk about them as visible minorities? Because it is euphemistic and it hides the reality of racialization, and because it is untenable as a concept when you move into majorities, I think it's better for us to use a term that clearly speaks to essentially name the experience. We are racialized. And a lot of the issues that we talk about are derived from the fact that we are racialized, derived from that experience of racialization.